So yeah, I don't even remember where this title came from, so I'll quickly skip past that. So yeah, why am I up here? I think if you've been to this conference before, certainly you know I do lots of DITA stuff for a long time now. That's all. So what I'm going to be talking about here, a bit of the history of the DITA-ot, where we've been, where we've come from, how we got where we are, what we've lost somewhat, but more importantly gained along the way as we go, and really how people in the audience, you know, some tricks for keeping up, like as we're migrating from version to version. Jarno mentioned about this release being backwards compatible. Not everything is always fully backwards compatible, and there are good reasons for that, which I'm going to talk about here, but how can you keep up when that happens? So that's the agenda. A bit of history, talk about some of our major changes. Some of it's going to be approximate, and then how can you keep up with that? But I think it would be nice to start off the conference here by finding out a little bit about the people in the crowd, hopefully. Wondering how long people here have been using DITA Open Toolkit. Isn't there anybody here that's really new to the tool or hasn't used it much? There are several, okay. Anybody using it for years and years and years, many versions? A few more? That's not surprising. I'm guessing there are a bunch of people in here in the audience who've been customizing, configuring, adding plugins, getting upset with their plugins. Yeah. Anybody here running 1.8 or earlier? Appropriate levels of shame as they're raising their hands. Yes, that's good. What about 2.x? I'm guessing a lot of people are still on 2.x. Yep. Some of the same people, which is somewhat heartening, actually. How about 3.x? Good, good. And how many of you have had to upgrade between all those versions? Yeah, that can be painful. So some of the history I'm going to give here, as I said, is kind of approximate, because at this point, when I say something was released in maybe 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, it doesn't really matter that much. It just means it was released a long time ago. So I'm going to talk about really the old overview of where we've gone. So if we reach way back in history, DITA-ot 1.0 actually came from a beta project that was out on IBM DeveloperWorks. That was a set of scripts that was written partly by non-software developers who were kind of the big thinkers coming up with DITA, and they figured out enough XSLT to script some things together, and it was really just Ant scripts and XSLT scripts that did a few things, and that was it. At that point, they came to my team in IBM, who did internal tool support for ID customers, and said, let's make this into something real. And it got a bunch bigger, and then it was given to another team to make open source, and that's where it came from. So the origins were not what you would usually expect to see from a big, fancy, new piece of software. It was a bunch of people hacking together, not really familiar with the tools, and then a bunch of software developers took over, and then it was handed off to other developers who'd never really worked with ID. They were just Java coders, said, oh, here, grab this team and put this into open source. So it was a weird mix of people, and kind of a weird result. But in order to qualify as successful at the time, really, the toolkit, you just had to be able to get HTML out of it. The PDF was incredibly basic at that point. There wasn't much support for PDF. And largely that's because the only people funding it at that point, which my team, IBM, we had another PDF solution at the time. And so we weren't using that. We needed good HTML out of the toolkit. And we wanted to provide something for PDF for everybody else outside of IBM, and that was it. Ease of use was something that people would laugh at in that early toolkit. When I first started talking to people outside of IBM, the very first times I would get kind of feedback on the toolkit, it was not good, really. It was really hard to use. It was a set of scripts and Java code, and you had to download it, and then you had to figure out what version of Ant to install, and maybe grab Saxon or Zaylan, and maybe some other libraries. And there was a bit of documentation for it, but not a lot. And it really, there were a couple of reasons behind that. Kind of the early thinking when putting this together was, it's going to be, the toolkit will be basically a library, and people will integrate it with their existing libraries, like Ant, like Java, like Saxon, which means we need to let them be free to choose what they're using. We have to be agnostic. Let people use their own XSLT processor because there are so many of them out there. And they had to connect everything, and that was not easy. It was very easy to mess up. And yeah, you really could mess that up. But at the same time, we expected people to customize. One of the reasons, well, the reason XSLT was chosen is because of the way it works with inheritance. You can override things. And so the goal all along was people are going to override anything and everything. But we didn't really give them a clear way to do that. In fact, I think in the first releases, the only clear way to do that was a parameter called args.xsl, where you said, instead of using the default XSL for HTML output, use mine, which probably imports all the main rules, but that's kind of a painful thing to do. So you could make it work, but it was hard. All of those intermediate steps were also XSLT, largely with the goal of letting people override them, but there was no way to do it without digging in, hacking through the code, which is hard, which is bad, which makes it really difficult to upgrade. But in addition to that, by expecting people to override everything, we had kind of an overriding goal from the start to not remove anything, because whatever is in there, someone might have picked up and started using and started overriding. And if we remove it, we'll break them. And that was, I mean, there wasn't much focus on, as I said, ease of use, making things easy to use right out of the box. There was absolutely a focus from day one on not breaking anything that anybody might have done somewhere, sometime to this tool. And that's really hard to keep up. So the early focus with changes really was on handling that usability issue. Make it possible to use by including those required tools, include Saxon or include Ant, and maybe try to come up with a better command line so people don't have to actually learn Ant in order to use the toolkit. And then the dreaded start command came in, which was a batch file to basically say, okay, set everything up and now you don't have to mess with your class path anymore. Because we don't really have, we didn't have people on the team that were going to create an actual installer that would set up your system to find everything, so start command was kind of a way around that. But a few of you I know saw my session about the DITA spec at DITA Europe, where I talked about trying to serve multiple audiences. The toolkit also had that problem early on. We tried to serve multiple audiences. We continued to try to serve that audience that was expected to use this as a library together with all of their existing stuff. And we also then tried to come up with, to serve the audience of the writer who didn't know anything about Java, anything about tools, and that's where start command came from. And then there was even a middle ground, and I no longer remember why we had that middle ground. So eventually, that was not really maintainable. We went back to one package. Multiple packages is too confusing. Almost everybody got the big one anyway. Over time, having a few extra megabytes in your download package really didn't matter quite as much. And when we say, here's the library, you can use your own Ant, you can use your own Saxon, that means people kind of expected us to test with every possible version of Ant and Saxon, and that was not maintainable. We didn't have people to do that. And yeah, everybody just got the big thing anyway, so why are we bothering with the little ones? And I think that may have been around the time Jarno got involved and basically said, what are you doing? Why do you have all these packages? And yeah. As far as customization goes, when PDF2 came in, that came from Idiom, an external company at the time that was later gobbled up by somebody. And they independently developed PDF2 outside of the core toolkit team. We were not involved with them at all until they released it separately as a plugin that you had to put into the demo directory at the time, I think. And then eventually it was donated to the toolkit. And it had its own configuration directory. And that was really a whole new way to customize that didn't have anything to do with the rest of the toolkit. So for a long time, that was the official way to customize, was to use PDF, first off, and to create a configuration directory. I think without a lot of documentation, which is always easy. Later, thanks to Deborah Pickett, who was heavily involved for a few years earlier on, around 1.4, 1.5, we came up with the plugin directories. I say we. She came up with the plugin directories, and that was great. That was a way to have the template files that you see if you dig through, if you ever get into developing the toolkit. The template files basically say, here's where the XSL starts off, but we have a way to insert things and then regenerate these shells for you to use. That made it possible to customize most of the XSL steps in the toolkit. Again, with the side effect that it made us a lot more wary of ever changing those steps because we know that people are in there customizing. When she did that, though, the rest of the toolkit pretty much stayed the same. We had ANT files all over the place, XSL files all over the place. And eventually, thanks to Jarno again coming in and saying, "What are you doing?" which is one of his major roles in the toolkit, most of the stuff that we ship became plugins. The base code all moved into a base plugin. XHTML moved into an XHTML plugin. Later we came along with the HTML5 plugin. So everything in there is a plugin, which theoretically means you could just strip out most of this code. Like if you don't want people producing XHTML, now you can quite easily just delete that directory, and whoever you're supporting with the toolkit can no longer produce XHTML. They're forced to upgrade to HTML5. I talk to some people who say, well, nobody uses that anyway. Everybody's on HTML5 now, right? It's like, that's what you think. No, a lot of people are using XHTML. Easy way to disable that is delete that directory. Also just keeps our root directories clear, which as a software developer, it's nice to have that clean directory. Improving on that even further, we now have the plugin referencing syntax, which if you are doing any customization of XSL and not quite of ANT, but really of XSL, you should absolutely be using this syntax. If you don't know it, you should get into the docs and become familiar with it, or look at the core code and see how we use it. It's a way to indirectly say, from this plugin, I want this XSL file, and import that. You don't have to have .. / plugin directory name / something else. In fact, you should never have that anymore. Just don't do that. Using this syntax means that if we move things around, if something moves around into a new plugin, or if the plugin is renamed, if something goes from the base directory into the base plugin, you never have to care. You never know. If you have a relative path, it'll break. If you have this plugin referencing syntax, you'll get the right thing no matter where we move it. So this is a way to make things a lot more stable. And yeah, it does finally remove a lot of dependencies on knowing the DITA-ot file structure. And that was one of the more painful things in my early days of customizing, was the plugin directories that had to do ... all the way up to the core directory and then down into XSL, XSL HTML. And yeah, that's all gone. So a lot of that older stuff, the ugly stuff, is what we refer to as technical debt. And who here knows what technical debt is? Several people. Somebody even raised 2 hands. You must be really into technical debt. Yeah, it's the stuff that accumulates that you wish wasn't there anymore, but you have to keep supporting for some reason. And if you travel along for years with the idea that you can't break what people have customized, you end up carrying along a lot of that technical debt. And technical debt is bad for a lot of reasons. It makes it hard to innovate. It makes it hard to put new things in when you can't break what's there. When you have to work around what's there, you end up having multiple ways to do the same thing. And in addition, if you keep carrying something along from release to release, people expect you to keep supporting it. And that's difficult. And we don't exactly have a giant development team here, so we don't want to keep supporting things that we know shouldn't be used anyway. So when thinking about that, we've done that several times in the past, and the goal with removing technical debt, or one of the goals with removing technical debts, is to just get rid of the old stuff that was poorly done, shouldn't be used anymore, especially if there's something better. Just get rid of the old. And one of the things we did early on was cut down on command lines. We started off, everybody had to use ANT. You had to learn ANT in the first few years of the toolkit. That was painful, and so at the time I went to the development team in IBM that was working on this. We had a small team outside of my team that was doing the open source side of things, and said, why don't we come up with an actual command line for our tool? So they came up with the Java command line, which was a little bit better than ANT. Not a lot, but it was better. But it wasn't great, and it didn't work like a lot of software command lines worked. And so Jarno came in and said, this is garbage, let's get rid of it. Before he got rid of it, he came up with the DITA command, which, as was stated earlier, that's what everybody should be using to interact with the toolkit now. It's an actual, sit down, design, let's make this work like other tools. How should this work? Do a clean, from scratch, actual command line. Once that's done, the Java one stuck around for a little while, but not too long, because again, we don't want to keep supporting that. And the longer it's there, the more people will keep using it. So at the same time, we want to replace all of these old things that were designed early on kind of on an ad hoc basis with actual simple documented interfaces to make it easier to maintain. So about technical debt, one of the ways I like to think about it is if you have something like this, a somewhat old-timey train, you might look at this, and if you're trying to design the next version, you lay out your requirements. Well, okay, it's got to be faster, but it's got to be able to go on the same track because this is the track we've always used, and we can't change that. It's too hard to change. We've got to be able to handle something that's this long of a car. We've got to be able to handle, all the basic requirements that really are based around what's there right now rather than what could be there. And if you try to base everything on what's there now, like if you have those same requirements in place, you must have the same gauge of track. You must have, all these things working the same. You're not going to get to the fancier cars that can go up the mountain. You're certainly not going to get to the high-speed rail that can travel on, well, you're never going to get one of those on the old tracks. And more importantly, you're never going to get off the ground because you've got your core assumptions that from now on everything has to keep working with this track on the ground. Well, you're not going to fly. So we've got a bunch of examples of things we've changed, technical debt we've gotten rid of, compatibility we may have broken, like the Java and Ant command lines. You can still use the Ant command line because we are still an Ant-based tool. You probably should not be using it. Probably DITA command is better for you, but that's not something we can get rid of. We did get rid of the Java command. As we've mentioned a few times, we've moved files around a lot over the last few years. And if you have updated your plugins to use that syntax, that should have remained invisible to you. Within our Ant scripting, Ant targets have moved. They've combined, been split apart, sometimes gone away. And usually that's a case where we decide that two functions should logically be together that were separately, like a Java step and then an XSLT step. It's like, oh, it can be a lot more efficient if we combine it. In the past, we probably wouldn't have done that because the efficiency gain would come at the cost of breaking an Ant script that separately called that target. Now, we make that change, we accept the breakage and document it. We've got new ways to call our Java code in the Ant scripts themselves. We have eventually, over time, removed a lot of XSL scripts and variables, and then more recently removed obsolete plugins that you can add back if you want, but nobody's supporting them, and it kind of gives a false impression, but that we keep them in there. Does anybody in the audience have other examples of stuff that we've broken that maybe we know about, maybe we don't? Are there any things we've done to break your plugins? Nobody's willing to confront me with it. Yes. No. No, really, we would like to know, and I'll get to that later. We do want to know. If we break your stuff and it's not in our docs, let us know. So now, on to the tricks, the weird tricks, which aren't really that weird. How can you keep up with your plugin development, with your customizations to the toolkit? Well, number one is read the release notes. I know that's a really weird idea. Nobody likes to read release notes. But they do tell you what's new and what's different, and they do tell you what has changed. They always link to the migrating topic if there's anything to migrate. At this point, we have migration topics going all the way back to 1.5.4. A bunch of those for the older releases in particular were added after the fact, so they may not be as comprehensive. For the last several years, I think together mostly with Roger here, they've been pretty good at keeping up with any changes that may have broken plugins in some way. So you can sequence through those from 1.5.4 all the way up to the latest release and see anything that we are aware of that would have broken your plugins because of our changes. And so yeah, as I say, they're much more comprehensive now. And they do track things that we've deprecated as well. It might not break yet, but it will break in the future, so it's already time for you to upgrade. And yeah, don't just read them and then move on. Actually update your customizations as you go is a great thing to do. It's always easier to upgrade one release than it is to upgrade 10 releases. And those of you who are still stuck on 1.8 are probably aware the idea of jumping up, what is it now, 12, 13 releases at one time might be why you never leave 1.8. It might be, it might seem at this point that it's easier to simply start over with some of your plugins. That may not be the case, but hard to say. And again, with those release notes, with those migration guides, If you are upgrading and you encounter a failure that is not in the migration docs, let us know. You can open a pull request against the docs. You can go to GitHub on our development docs, and even if it's for a release 5 releases ago, 5 years ago, those migration topics are, I mean, in theory, they're still under maintenance. We're not updating the docs from version 3.1, but we will absolutely update the migration topic about moving to 3.1. So if you go to the development docs, you can click on the edit this topic link. It'll open up an editor in your browser, make the changes, suggest what we should have added in there, and submit a pull request to Roger. And as I say, upgrade as often as you can. Yeah, easier said than done, depends on your circumstances. For some people this is really easy, for some it's not, and it depends on how you deploy the toolkit in your organization, if it's just you, if it's a lot of people. And, but generally speaking, it is easier to get information about new releases than about old ones. It's easier to get help migrating for new releases. If you come to us now and say, I'm trying to move from 3.3 to 3.4, which was released this morning, this isn't working, can I get help? Chances are we're going to know exactly what to do. If you have that same question about migrating from 2.2 to 2.4, it's like we're going to have to really stretch back in our memories to help with that. And yeah, not a lot of people are going to be able to provide quick help. At the same time, not only is it easier to migrate, easier to get help with migrations, those older releases aren't really under support. We don't have a big team doing support for old releases. And if somebody issues a defect against 2.3, I think I saw one come into the issue tracker recently. I'm using 2.3, this is breaking. It's like, on my system, I don't have a copy of 2.3 anymore. The first question is going to be, does this issue still exist in the latest release? If it doesn't, we're not going back to 2.3 to fix it. So there are a lot of reasons to keep up to date. And yeah, breaking the work down into smaller pieces makes everything go a little bit smoother. Upgrade one release at a time. I mentioned the dangers earlier of getting into the core code back in 1.1, 1.2 when that was the only option. Definitely stay out of the core code. This was another tip from Roger's talk at DITA Europe. Stay out of the core code. You can play around in there, but if you go in and make a change to one of our XSL files, one of our Ant scripts, and you just go in and tweak the code, if you forget you've done that, when you upgrade, you're going to lose your change. If you need to upgrade but keep a lot of things you've changed in there, you're going to have to do a lot of file diffs, and it's going to be painful, and it's not a good way to go. Keep your stuff in a plugin, and yeah, if you do feel you need to get into the core code, which I do myself sometimes in our implementation, it's usually because something's broken. It's not because I want a new feature. If something's broken, I go in and I try to fix it. Once you've fixed it, submit a pull request against the toolkit, ideally. Let us know. Say, I had to change this thing because it was broken. And that way, the next time you upgrade, presumably your fix will already be part of the core code. You won't have to think about it again. And yeah, changing core code without using plugins eventually makes updates cost prohibitive. And that's bolded and emphasized because I've seen that happen. I've seen people who were stuck on 1.4 and they just could not update. They did not know how to migrate. They didn't have the money to spend to update all of the changes they'd made because they did everything in the core code. So you can get stuck. Number 4, trick to make your plugins easier to upgrade. Yeah, use those productivity enhancements that we've added. In your XSL files, it's the plugin syntax, plugin : for your imports. Get this thing from whatever other plugin directory. In Ant code, whenever you create a plugin now, every plugin that is created in the toolkit automatically defines Ant parameters for the directory that it sits in. So you can use a parameter that's like plugin.something.dir. I don't remember the exact syntax offhand, but it's a common syntax where you use the plugin ID, and by using that parameter, you're automatically referencing someone else's plugin. And so if their plugin moves, you don't care. Again, it just keeps everything safer. For Ant extensions, use DITA file set. That's something that Jarno added several releases ago. And it's a way to say, instead of looking for all of the DITA files in the temp directory or everything with a specific extension, you can say, process, with this XSL program I'm adding, process every DITA file with conref. Process every DITA file that's a normal processing role. And it gets you the files you need and nothing else. and everything's simpler and faster and better. Manage your own technical debt. I've talked about the things that we've gotten rid of. Chances are, if you're writing plugins, you will eventually accumulate your own technical debt. I've got that in my own plugins, and I have trouble with this sometimes. I don't always remove it when I should. If you've got something in there to work around a bug in the toolkit, and then that bug is eventually fixed in the toolkit, you don't need that workaround anymore, and you should clean it out. Because if you don't, it's going to make your code harder to maintain. It's going to, in 2 years from now, you're going to forget why it was there and think, oh, I must need this, and it'll stick around forever. So yeah, as I say, it is difficult. And Roger presented about a bunch of things like this and tips on creating your own plugins to make them work better in his session. Work with us. We're not scary. There are several ways to work with us. We have regular contributor calls every month. There's a call that 5 or 6 of us at least, I think 5 or 6 people from this room tend to call into regularly. Sometimes there's as many as 10. There are a bunch of people on the invite list that don't necessarily come. But every month we have a call and we talk about what we're working on and what we're planning. And if you had been at those for the last few months, we let the secret slip that we were planning to release today. It would not have been a surprise like it was for all of you in the room. Yeah, so we have those calls. We also monitor the GitHub issues. You can monitor our project and get notifications about all the issues, all the pull requests. You can see all the things that either people are complaining about or the new features that Jarno's adding, or yeah, keep track of what's going on. We do have a DITA-ot Slack channel, and I think if you want to join that now, we added this some years ago. I think it's slack.ditaot.org will take you right to the invite page to get into the team. And yeah, more importantly, let us know what you're doing. It's a lot easier for us to not break you if we know what you're doing. And one way to do that is to be here in this room, which you have all done already, so yay you. We do like to hear from you. Yes, we are probably in a good mood today, certainly now that we've had our coffee. And yeah, this is a good time to come up to chat with us one-on-one, talk about what you're doing, what you would like to see in the toolkit, or see changed, or see not changed. All of those are options. So talk to us, please. If we're hiding under the table, it's probably best to leave us alone. But otherwise, yeah. Thank you for being here. Any questions? Yes?
Do you know when you're thinking about the future of anything that is a big change that could impact like something like a major release because we're doing things around the toolkit, and if you change the node, we don't care if it improves it, but maybe we'll spend less time and wait if there's like big changes coming.
Oh, so like actually right now something we're planning for the future?
Yes.
I don't know of big changes that we're planning right now. Other than
at this moment.
we're not planning. I think I've considered renaming every one of our files to include Jarno's initials, but otherwise, no, I don't think we have big things that we have planned that would disrupt anyone for anything. No. Yeah, I think most of the reorg is already done. In terms of reorg, getting everything into plugin directories was probably the biggest thing. With 3.3, we moved the catalog into the base plugin directory, and that was something that, initially it's like that was one of the last cleanup items moving into a plugin. And rightly so, a bunch of people said this is going to break a lot of people because a lot of tools rely on the toolkit's catalog to find everything. And so there's still a stub that's left in the base directory that basically redirects to the base one. And I don't know if that stub is going to go away at any point, so that might be, that's the only thing I can think of.
One thing we should point out is that it wasn't just the catalog file that moved for 3.3. Because the base plugin code moved to the plugin subdirectory, the XSL files actually moved. So in 3.3, if you had customized things and were expecting there to be an XSL directory in the root installation folder of the toolkit, it's not there anymore. It's in the or DITA base plugin directory now. that is one of those things that is mentioned in the migration topic. So anyone that looked at that would know that. But if you didn't look at that, that might be surprising, because if one of your developers just expected to find a file of a certain name in a certain place, that might have moved in 3.3. And that's exactly the reason that we recommend people look at the migration topics.
I'm good like with moving things around. It's not we will divide everything differently, or like have a different philosophy behind how things are inherited or something like that. But, yeah.
That will be. So that.
I am also scared of George sometimes.
So that would be a major release, meaning a clear signal that we're breaking something. What I would like to do is to make OT more library-like from a developer perspective. But that means most of our current users who customize it somehow would feel that they are suddenly faced with a steep learning curve. So we can't really make it a library that's only sort of extendable by programmers. So we don't want to force you to learn that many new things. So in a way, it's a conscious decision to try and keep it the same, even though we might get some benefit from it. Unfortunately, OT isn't built for developers. It's built for people who are not coders but code anyway. Meaning, well,
I think that's a good way to describe it. Yeah. I mean, the expectation has always been this will be used by authors, and some of those authors will dig in and change the code a little bit. And it's not something written for software developers. So, yeah. I do think that if any major changes come, like philosophical changes or changes that would really break things and everybody who's calling it needs to change some way, that would definitely be a point where we shifted to 4.0. It wouldn't be 3.5, 3.6, 3, something like that. Not in the short term. Like next month, absolutely not. No. We don't know yet what the next release will be. I think we haven't officially decided anything.
Okay. Thanks, Robert.